Hey guys, welcome to book review 115. Today I will be reviewing The Lost Heart of Asia by Colin Thubron. Do that backwards. Well, in any case, in this book, the famed author, try to keep this book out of the way a little bit, Colin Thubron travels to Central Asia at the fall of the Soviet Union around 92, 93. Well, I think it was 91, but it was shortly thereafter when all the, you know, um, independent republics were being established. Anyway, he kind of goes one by one through each of the states, starting in Turkmenistan, up to Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and finally Kazakhstan. He actually goes back to Kyrgyzstan a little bit, but as typical of Colin Thubron, he really describes the people very well. He spent the majority of his time, I'd say, in sort of the heart of what is the heart of Asia, Central Asia being the heart of Asia in this book. That specifically being Bukhara and Samarkand. I believe I'm pronouncing it that correctly. These both being ancient capitals of khanates and kind of important historical places where a lot of power was wielded. A lot of power since then has gone up to Tashkent. Both these cities are in Uzbekistan. The capital of Uzbekistan now being Tashkent. But he started in Turkmenistan. Turkmenistan is the most sort of I guess you call, well, both Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan are very nomadic, have a very nomadic history, but Kazakhstan's more steppe nomadic, whereas Turkmenistan is plains nomadic. They're also the one that's most influenced Turkmenistan, that is, by Iran, and he actually mentioned in the history of Turkmenistan multiple raids on the settled peoples of Iran. I think it is a similar relationship to like the Mongols and the Chinese being settled, the Iranians being settled. They're both being of somewhat similar stock, but the Turkmens raiding the Iranians for slaves and etc., etc., etc. He witnesses a wedding there. As per typical in all of these republics, there's a large Russian influence that is immigrating out, or is if they are staying, they're very worried about their future because they're no longer under the motherland of the Soviet Union. They're under what is essentially independent nations that are going to be majority controlled by the ethnic groups in those countries, which is obviously justified, but would create sort of panic for any person that had previously been in power. So, and obviously justified in the sense that they control the government. Now, every action that these governments, and this has since been proven true in history, that every action of those governments is not necessarily justified, if that makes sense. Okay, so he moves up across the Amu Daria, which is one of the two kind of central waterways, most important waterways in this region. The other being the Saira Daria. So there's the Amu Daria and the Saira Daria. The southern one being the Amu. And it's mentioned almost that it's like a river that, at least in history, in historical accounts, the river that is an ocean. Not really so much when it's in the Pamirs, in the mountain ranges and the larger Himalayan mountain ranges, but once it gets down into the Central Asian plain, it spreads and there's a lot of alluvial flooding and that kind of stuff, which creates a great farming area. Now, unfortunately, under the Soviets, a lot of that farming was mass agriculture of cotton, etc., 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 and it really destroyed a lot of the land. He specifically mentions this when he takes his side trip up to Kunia Urchin, something like that. And anyway, these streets are largely like I get the feeling all over the Soviet Union that they kind of overbuild in these large sort of boorish. What's the word he used? Very kind of overly strong concrete blocks. Brutish, or brutal, like brutal, concrete blocks. And the hope being that under some sort of utopian system, these could all be filled and would make sense. Obviously, the system can't back up the ambition, and therefore you have all these sort of kind of still intact but semi crumbling buildings that people like the water doesn't always work and heat doesn't always work, and it's kind of they're vacant and that kind of thing. And you see this even in the big ones in the big cities, but even in the smaller towns, you see smaller buildings, but also what you see is this sort of a utopian layout of a very impersonal grid pattern that was implemented by the Soviets. And he sees a lot of, the biggest problem with Central Asia in terms of agriculture, and I mentioned this in terms of the overuse of irrigation, is the land is inherently kind of salty, and if there's too much agriculture, then that salt rises to the surface, and you're essentially poisoning your land so that it can't be used for agricultural purposes, or it certainly won't be as productive as the ambition of it would be. So let's see. Yeah, back to Bukhara and Samarkand. There were a number of khanates that operated out of Bukhara, but really the monster in the room, at least in terms of archaeological digs and architecture, was Tamerlane that was in Samarkand. I guess that makes sense. But anyway, he was a offshoot of the Mongols that at least claimed inheritancy from the Mongols. I think maybe like he was maybe in the 1600s, or no, it's like in the 1400s. I don't remember exactly, but the link was a bit tenuous, and by that point the Mongols had long disbanded and left the area. But he kind of resurrected the brutal killing of the Mongols and really ruled with an iron fist, and really made Samarkand his capital, sort of his imperial capital, in the sense that he would bring architects from all over. He basically essentially just raided the rest of Central Asia as well as Iran, parts of Iraq. I don't know if you've ever gotten to Pakistan or not, but essentially raided all their scholars and all of their trappings of civilization, and then just forced them back to Samarkand to create a new capital for himself. So you had Samarkand, and then obviously you had the Soviets on top of that. It's still being a very large city. Bukhara is, I think, a little smaller, maybe in the couple 100,000 range, but Samarkand, I think, is in the like upper, not a million, but like getting towards there. That's also when it gets closer to the Pamirs. The big sort of divide in this book is between the lowland, either desert or steppe agriculture lands, and the mountainous people. And the largest part of civilization is kind of where the two meet. So if you think of like the Rockies aren't very populated and the Great Plains aren't very populated, but like Denver and Albuquerque and I guess Calgary, those are all places where the two meet and for whatever reason create an environment where people can live. Okay, let's see. He goes up to Tashkent, then that's really when he gets into the Pamirs. He visits Kyrgyzstan briefly. There's actually a famous sheikh that's in Shachi Mandan. Oh, and I guess I forgot to mention he goes through the Fergana Valley. The Fergana Valley is kind of a sort of indentation in the Pamirs where there's this big valley. And what's interesting about it is because it's an indentation at a relatively lowland elevation, at least compared to the Pamirs, and it's not out on the desert. It's the most fruitful area of Central Asia, to the point where prior to mass agriculture, there were reports in the 1900s of just like orchards upon orchards and melons and all this stuff. Now, a lot of it has been used, or the water has been dried up for irrigation at other areas of Central Asia, as well as crops that aren't as productive, like cotton, that just need a lot of water and maybe aren't best for the area, that the Soviets just kind of forced in during this time period. Yeah, so the Fergana Valley, there's the Sheikh of Shamchi Mandan, who I believe, I'm not 100% correct, but I know what he was. He was a rebel against when the initial wave of Islam came to Central Asia. He was, I believe, a rebel. Like, that could definitely be wrong, but it feels like that was the story that was told, was that he was a rebel and then was forced inland, and they had a shrine there, and this is a part of Uzbekistan that is completely enclosed within Kyrgyzstan, but because of its historical significance, it's still part of Uzbekistan. Kyrgyzstan, he sees a lot of shepherds, a lot of people like that. We'll talk about more about Kyrgyzstan when he gets really to the heart of Kyrgyzstan, which is in the north. The southern part of Kyrgyzstan largely being just, even for Kyrgyzstan, remote. So there's that. Then he turns in and goes through, I don't know what this pass is. It's not mentioned on here. But it's a pass through northern Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, or southern Kyrgyzstan and northern Tajikistan. And really, northern Tajikistan is like southern Kyrgyzstan, in that it's very, even for Tajikistan, it's very isolated, not a lot of people, kind of very highland valleys, if that makes sense. So obviously, when you're driving roads, you're not going to drive over the top of the mountain. And they do have valleys, but they're very sort of highland valleys. But what made this interesting is that makes it kind of inappropriate for agriculture, and there are occasionally like herders and people that go through there. But what I thought was interesting was the description of the way that Colin described it. It was very, very, very different from the desert. Kind of green and lush in an area of the world that is not green and lush. The sky is both low and high at the same time. Low in the sense that it hits the clouds around you, but high in the sense that it doesn't come down to you. I mean, I think it sometimes does come down to you, but it's neither big sky country nor like Seattle weather. It's sort of like very stormy and rainy, but you also get the big vistas too, which I thought was really, really kind of a great description. And he describes these kind of mountainous, rushing rivers that kind of flood the valley, and how they run over the rocks and everything. It's just Colin's one of those writers that like sometimes he's overly descriptive, but when he does, and it's like, come on, you're just drowning on a little bit here. But when he does really hit the point, and it's not like he goes on and it doesn't make sense. It all makes sense in the context of the scene and is very vivid, but sometimes it just doesn't connect, like, to you personally. But when it does connect, it's really on point. And that was one of the points that really hit for me when he was describing his drive with this crazy Uzbek driver whose name I can't remember. I read this book a little bit ago, from Tashkent, that was just like a devil-may-care attitude and driving through these remote areas where if their car broke down, who knows what the hell they'd do. Anyway, they go to, they eventually arrive in the southern part of Tajikistan, the more settled part, the more populous part. Tajiks being the only Iranian ethnicity in Central Asia. The rest of Central Asia, it's ethnic people, it's ethnic inhabitants are all Turkish, but Tajikistan are actually Iranians. And I think it was one of the upheavals in Iran, not recently, but a long, long time ago, that came from, I don't know if it was the Baghdad Caliphate or exactly what it was, or maybe it was persecution for Iranians mostly being Shiites and the rest of the Arab world mostly being Sunnis. But anyway, they were pushed into further east into the Pamirs and what is now Tajikistan. Now, the primary difference is that Turks kind of are mixed. Some of them have like longish faces. Some of them are much more Mongoloid, like a more Asiatic look. But Tajiks are almost universally like long faced, like look like Iranians. They don't look like Chinese. So, which is very different than even their seemingly geographically close neighbors of Kyrgyzstan or the Uzbeks or people like that. Anyway, he goes all the way to the border of Afghanistan. Does not go into Afghanistan because this book is not about Afghanistan. In the city of Termiz, turns back up to Samarkand, back up to Tashkent, before going to the Anzob Pass. This being another people that were pushed into the Pamirs by I think an earlier time than the Tajiks, in the sense that they were not Muslim, and they hold a language very similar to the language that was used between not the Macedonians of Alexander the Great, but the Persians, the Persian Empire that Alexander the Great conquered. The language that's now used in Persia is not the language that was used then. In this very remote group up in the eastern, or excuse me, the it's kind of hard to describe exactly where it is, but the mountains of Tajikistan, in another area that's remote, I guess you'd say. Though it's hard to describe. It's in the west, but it's in a mountain region, sort of. They're the only ones that hold connection to these ancient Persians, and Daria, I believe, was his name, that went up against Alexander the Great, and how they retreated across as Alexander the Great did his conquering. Anyway, it moves back up to Tashkent. Describes it as just overpopulated, and he did not want to spend very much time there, which I was a little surprised by. I would think Tashkent would have more culture, but he largely just ignored that and moved on. That's when he gets into Kazakhstan, goes to Turkestan. Now, the primary difference in Kazakhstan is the of all the Central Asian republics, is the one that was most Russianified, or most Slavic, I guess you should say, in the sense that Russia had the most influence on them. So you see a lot of debate about the path that they should take, what the future should be. There's also a divide between northern Kazakhs and southern Kazakhs. So the northern Kazakhs, historically, even before the Russians came in, were much more pure nomadic, whereas the southern Kazakhs, because they had more interaction with the people of the Fergana Valley, they were almost all of the Sir Darya, that river that I mentioned early on, is within their borders. They were much more semi-nomadic. And if that's not necessarily true absolutely in the modern sense, that mentality still holds true. So, yeah, he goes on the train ride from Tashkent to Turkestan. He kind of describes all of that. He also sees a famous mosque in Turkestan that is considered one of the most holy places in Central Asia. And basically, like Islam has this deal where you should go to Mecca in your lifetime if you can, but if you can't, there are a number, because of just impoverishment or whatever the circumstances are, there are a number of places around the Islamic world that can provide, if not what Mecca can provide, at least a close second, if you will. And for the Uzbeks, who are not particularly wealthy, Turkestan and the shrines there, who have a different name, but the name I can't particularly remember, that's the place for them. Anyway, after that, he heads up kind of north east, going to the capital of Almaty. And Almaty is described as kind of like a Russian town. Again, the Kazakhs are not really a settled people. They were only truly settled, not semi-nomadic, but truly settled after the Russians came. So, yeah, he describes it almost as like there were points when he was in the middle of the city and felt that he was not even in a city, that he was in some forest somewhere. And I think that's how it is that the Russians very much spread out. Well, initially it was a very small settlement, but when it started becoming big, they spread it out over a very large area. And there's really no center of the city. It felt the only thing that kind of provides some measure of direction or orientation in Almaty is that to the south of the city is where the mountains start rising. So you can always kind of pinpoint from there and then move around. I believe, I don't know if it was in Almaty or Bishkek that he visited this Christian missionary. I think that was in Bishkek. Yeah, so Almaty was good. Oh, I guess he took a plane flight up to Karaganga before he went to Bishkek. Karaganga, actually Almaty is no longer the capital of Kazakhstan. I believe it's Anastasia, but Almaty was the historical capital. But anyway, to Karaganga. Karaganga and Anastasia are both in the north. So I previously described the north. And he really didn't spend that much time there, but what he did describe was this city that was almost like a gulag city, that like once people got out of the gulag, they weren't necessarily allowed to travel back to, this is Russians, necessarily being allowed to travel back to Western Russia, Moscow, St. Petersburg, or wherever they're from, the Ukraine, or, it was also, ethnic Ukrainians and Poles and all sorts of people. They weren't necessarily allowed to travel back, but they were out of the gulag. So they were just kind of stuck in this kind of weird spot where they kind of just created this city out in the middle of the steppe. And it's just kind of like, he described it as a city where it's not like Pyongyang where it's just unfunctional, but like the lights are all, it's like a city that's sleeping. Like it functions, but it's just kind of like the world just kind of feels like it's shut down. Like a world outside of this shut down, slowly running city just doesn't exist. Like it's just kind of like slow motion. I mean, not necessarily in a positive way, in a way that's like a city kind of set apart by time and the fact that its politics are the way that they are. Anyway, he goes back to Almaty and then down to Bishkek. In Bishkek, he visits with a Christian missionary, a Korean Christian missionary, which is something I find interesting about the Koreans, and I've known this from previous books that I read, is that there's more of a diaspora of Koreans across Central Asia, northern China, and southern Russia, or southern Siberia, really, than any other Asian ethnic group. I don't exactly know why that is, but there's definitely a Korean presence in both Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. Anyway, they go to, they're finally, after the Soviet Union broke up, they're allowed to practice their religion freely, and a number of converts come, particularly because it's very troubling times. One of the things I forgot to mention is when the breakup of the Soviet Union happened, it was very dicey. I mean, it's still not a great place to live, but it was really dicey when the Soviet Union broke up. Essentially, inflation was so bad that people couldn't afford necessities, and so people started working on sort of a trader basis, and that's how you get your economy to tank. But anyway, a lot of people, for better or worse, turned to religion when that happened. So he meets a couple Christianaries, and then they go out to Lake Izikal. There's some great descriptions there along the lakeside. There's a potential military base that they're not allowed to go to. The rumor being that the military tested torpedo submarines in the lake as a way to not expose themselves to the ocean, in which case another submarine might come by and say, hey, what are you doing? From like NATO or something like that. So they would test out these torpedoes in this lake, which was pretty crazy. But the lake's very large. It's, I don't know, 100, 150 miles wide, something like that. Eventually, they wind up near the border with China, though not quite. And the book ends with, I mentioned, Samarkand and Talimand. No. The leader. Oh my gosh, am I forgetting this? Samarkand. Okay, well, I forget what the leader's name is. Oh jeez, am I really gonna look this up? Tamerland. Why did I say Tamerland? Tamerland, who was the vicious leader in Samarkand. Yeah, Samarkand. Tamerland was the vicious leader who ruled from Samarkand. And his final sort of Waterloo, if you will, was the fact that being the son or the descendant of Mongols, he controlled all of what amounted to the Western, or a good chunk of, the Western Mongol Empire, not into Europe, but kind of like the Central Asian region. That was a very large region. And he wanted to reunify what was the old Mongol Empire by attacking China. And his final Waterloo was the fact that he went to China, lost, and what the book ends on is when they went over the pass from Central Asia to China. It's also being the end of the book for Colin, very symbolically. Everyone put a stone in this big pile called a cairn, and then when they came back, they were to take the stone away. Well, what happened was there were so many people killed in this campaign that the cairn eventually, or most of the cairn was left. There was only a small percentage that survived and was able to make it back to Central Asia. And so even to this day, 800 years later, there is a cairn that exists, and that's where Colin goes, and that's the end of the book. Okay, it was very good. Colin Thubron is obviously a tremendous writer, and much like In Siberia and To a Mountain in Tibet, I was not disappointed. It's a good book. Read it. Okay, I probably should have done a little bit more review about the writing style itself, but it was very good. All right, peace out, you guys. Bye.